Death is a Giant Worm by Tessa Kaye. Read by Logan.
I didn't tell anyone what I saw the day my friend Cameron disappeared. It seems so distant now, like a dream I've long since awoken from. I'm not even sure if the memory is real. My therapist says it isn't, that it's just my way of processing what happened. I want to believe him. Of course I want to believe that it's all just some figment of my imagination. But what I saw that day, it's still so vivid in my mind, I'm not sure I can. The summer before my second year of junior high, my friends and I walked to the creek behind our school's baseball field almost every day. It was our favorite place to go, and it wasn't unusual for us to stay until it was dark out. 4 kids alone at night wasn't quite the big deal back then that it is now. On one particular day, we had decided to bring our fishing poles out. None of us were all that good at fishing except for Johnny. Johnny always caught the biggest fish in the creek. That night, while the rest of us were catching sticks and moss, Johnny had managed to catch 3 medium-sized brown trout.
"I told you dingnuts we should have gotten some night crawlers,"
Cameron said when we were loading up our poles and tackle boxes to head home.
We all said, "No, let's just use worms. Look how many fish your stupid worms caught."
"We all fished with worms," David retorted, "and Johnny caught 3. You're just not any good." "I let them all go anyway," said Johnny. "Wasn't any big enough to do nothing with." When all of our things were packed up, we all started to walk home, except for Cameron. Cameron had recently gotten a bike for his birthday and couldn't stop bragging about it. While the rest of us walked, he rode ahead in the road, swerving back and forth, taking his hands off the handlebars in an attempt to show off. None of us were impressed, but we got a good laugh when his no-hands trick almost hit him head down a ditch. And then Cameron rounded a curve up ahead of us in the road. We called out that we couldn't see him and for him to slow down and let us catch up. But if he heard us, he didn't answer. We were all rolling our eyes, thinking his mom might be mad if she found out that he'd gotten away from our group. But aside from general annoyance, none of us really cared or thought much of his separation. Then we heard it. The sound of tires skidding as the driver attempted to brake. The scream that must have come from Cameron. And the sickening thud of something heavy slapping wetly against the pavement. The worst sound, though, was the seconds of silence that followed after. We all stopped dead in our tracks, stunned and processing, until a car came flying past, snapping us back into reality. The front windshield was a spiderweb of cracks and huge dents marking the front bumper and roof, and we ran up to catch with Cameron. At first, we thought he was dead. Blood had pooled around his head on the pavement, and his arms were twisted underneath him. Meat was exposed in the cuts on his sides, and a bone protruded from one of his legs. His bike and fishing pole were in a similar state, a crumpled mess of metal a few feet away. All I could do was stare at my friend, the sound of my own blood rushing in my eardrums, blocking out any other noises that might have been there. Somewhere close by, David threw up. Johnny was the only one with enough sense to run to the house closest to us and call for an ambulance. Our parents came and hurried us back to our houses, away from the blinking lights and sirens of the ambulance and police cars. The cops tried to talk to us as we were being pulled away, but our parents just ignored them or shouted that we needed to go home, not be traumatized further. I remember laying in my bed that night and staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way that Cameron had looked lying on the ground. The image wouldn't seem to leave my mind. When my mother came to check on me, her eyes were red-rimmed and glassy, and she didn't say a word. I thought then that it must have been true. Cameron must really have been dead. But the next morning, when my mother called me down for breakfast, she told me that Cameron was in surgery, and that it would be a while before he was ready to go. But that we could visit him at the hospital when the doctor said it was okay. I had never felt so relieved in my life as I chewed my cornflakes. The first time we walked into his hospital room, I saw that one of Cameron's legs and both his arms had thick white casts on them, and his neck was in a brace. He had also apparently suffered some sort of brain injury. Thick white gauze covered most of the top of his head, and that would keep him hospitalized for a while. For most of the visit, he drifted in and out of sleep. When his eyes would close, he would lie so still he'd look dead, and I would flash back to that moment when I saw him lying in the road, a twisted, broken mess. A few times I thought he might actually be dead, passed away in his sleep from his injuries. So I'd poke one of his casts and his body would jerk a little in pain, and my mom would swat my shoulder and scold me. When he was awake, he didn't talk very much. mostly sticking to polite yeses and nos. When he did talk, his voice would be very hoarse, like he had pneumonia or he'd smoked for 50 years. To be honest, I left the first visit wishing I hadn't gone at all. But the next time we went, he was sitting up and his mom was helping him eat. He talked more, and his voice wasn't as hoarse. And at the third visit, he was complaining about his leg itching in its cast and not being able to scratch it. He seemed to go back to himself pretty quickly. And after almost 2 months, his casts were coming off and he was able to go home with his neck brace still on and a follow-up appointment scheduled to see how his brain was healing. When school started back up that August, Cameron was back with it. He seemed to be the same old Cameron, complaining when he got a bottom locker and even rejoining us at the creek in the afternoons, only now on foot. Once again, we were seeing him every day. Maybe that's why we didn't notice at first that he had started to change. I don't know at the time exactly what it was, but I can remember the precise moment when I first realized that something was wrong with Cameron. We were at the creek again, and Johnny had just caught a crappie. Cameron wasn't whining about it, though, because he wasn't fishing. Instead, he was sitting on the ground near our things, pushing dirt around with his finger. He hadn't really spoken much since we'd gotten there, though I hadn't thought much about it at the time. He'd been talking less and less those days, but none of us had yet noticed the change in his temperament. It feels stupid not to have seen it now. Not when before he'd hardly ever shut his mouth. But there he was, just sitting quietly, playing in the dirt. Johnny looked over at him. "Hey, Cam, could you bring me another worm, please?" Johnny said. Cameron jumped and his head shot up, his eyes wide. "What?" "Give me a worm out," Johnny said. Cameron looked around and saw the containers of worms sitting a few feet from him. He reached for them and stood, brushing dirt off the back of his shorts. When he opened the lid, he froze, and his face seemed to lose some of its color. We watched while Cameron reached in and picked up a single worm, held it out a few inches from his face, and inspected it with glazed eyes. "Everything okay?" asked Johnny after a few long seconds. Cameron didn't respond. "Hey, Dingnut," David shouted. "He asked you a question." Cameron jumped again and almost dropped the worm. He looked at us, looking at him, and something in him seemed to go sour. His confused, dazed expression turned to one of pure rage as he threw the container of worms down on the ground.
"You all think you're so much better than me!" he shouted. "You can get your own dumb worms!"
We watched, shocked, as Cameron began to march away from us up the road, where we knew he shouldn't be going by himself. I felt panic rise in my chest as I saw him approaching the asphalt, rushing so far ahead of us. Seeing him go made me feel like we were back on the day of the accident. I was frozen to the spot, waiting for the car we'd seen to come flying around the corner and finish what it had started. But it didn't. We all began to rush to gather up our things and hurry after Cameron. By the time we caught up to him, he was almost home. As we approached his driveway, we hoped his mother hadn't been looking out of the window, that she hadn't seen me, David, and Johnny running behind Cameron, clearly having let him get ahead. We knew, though, that she likely had. She was always looking out the windows now when Cameron wasn't home, always waiting for him to come walking up. And sure enough, the next day at school, Cameron told us he couldn't go to the creek that afternoon. From that day, I began to notice more and more that something in Cameron just didn't seem right. He steadily grew more silent, and seemed to always be in a daze, staring down at his hands or feet. At first, we would have to raise our voices to get his attention. Then we had to wave a hand in front of his face. After a while, even poking him was unreliable. Mostly, he just didn't notice anyone around him. He didn't complain anymore either. He never argued with David, or whined about how Johnny was making better grades without having to do any studying. He didn't object or call us bossy when we started having to tell him that he needed to get a pencil out, or that the teacher had called on him, or when we steered him from class to class. He'd just move where we told him, or where we'd push him when it came to that. It was getting to a point past strange to downright creepy, and our teachers were starting to notice too. It was like he wasn't even there anymore. At first, they tried to get his attention in class and write him up when he zoned out or didn't respond. After a while, though, they just let it go. Rumors began to spread among our classmates that his brain injury must not have healed properly, and that before long, he would be a vegetable. Then in November, the mumbling started. For weeks, Cameron had just sat silently, not responding to anyone's attempts to talk to him. Johnny, David, and I were so used to his voice being a rarity that the day we noticed him mumbling under his breath, we were excited. We thought he was recovering. We were in the cafeteria when we saw his mouth moving, and we got quiet, giving him a chance to say whatever he was going to say. He didn't speak up. We leaned in close to him, trying to hear whatever it was coming from his mouth, but we couldn't make out the words, and Cameron gave no sign that he even realized we were trying to listen to him. He just stared at the table, moving his lips but not attempting to make his voice audible. Still, at 12, we thought this might have been progress. Speaking, no matter how quietly or pointlessly, must have meant something of a positive effect. About a week after we noticed the mumbling, we decided to go to Cameron's house after school. Since he hadn't been coming with us to the creek, we figured that to see him outside of school, we'd need to visit him at home. His mom let us in, smiling and practically bouncing down the hall to tell him he had company. She seemed happier to see us than she ever had before. Maybe it was because it meant she wouldn't have to be alone with her own son now. He didn't look up when she spoke to him, or give any sign of acknowledgement when we entered the room. He just sat, staring down at the carpet. His mother's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained it as she told us to make ourselves at home. "Cam?" I asked as soon as his mother had walked away. Cameron kept his gaze down, not hearing me. His mouth was moving again, and we all moved closer, straining to hear the words. It was the same jumble of noise that we'd heard for the past week, and at first we still couldn't make out the words. But now we were away from all the loudness of the school. As we let the quiet settle over us, we inched in even closer to our friend, and we finally began to make sense of those sounds he was making.
"The worms crawl in. The worms crawl out. The worms crawl in. The worms."
Over and over again, he repeated those words. A shiver ran down my spine, and I glanced around at the faces of my friends to see them all wearing the same expression. Pale, brows furrowed slightly, and their chests rising and falling just a little faster than before. Cameron's mumbled phrase was creepy, to say the least. "I think we should go," Johnny finally said, breaking our chance. We quickly left Cameron's room, only pausing on our way out to thank his mother for having us. She seemed a little deflated by our departure, but waved at us as we walked away. The next day at school, the mumbling had stopped again. Cameron stayed in a near motionless state until our second-to-last class of the day. All of us sat, consumed by boredom as we watched the teacher draw out plot mountains on the board. She was almost done writing the falling action of our assigned rating when Cameron let out a small, mangled cry and fell stiffly out of his desk. The whole class turned to see what had happened, and then high-pitched shrieks emerged from somewhere within him. They filled the classroom, echoing off the walls, and eventually it seemed as if there were 100 people screaming, instead of one boy. Cameron clawed at his skin, his nails raking bloody scratches over the surface of his arms. He jerked and twitched for hours-long seconds. No one moved, unsure of what was happening and unable to look away, scared it would never end.
"They're on me!"
Cameron wailed, tears streaming down his face. "They won't get off!" Eventually, gasping sobs replaced the screams as his body went from violent thrashing to a steady tremble. The teacher rushed out of the room and returned seconds later with the nurse at her heels. Together they removed Cameron from the class. Not even a minute later, the bell rang, and dazed, we packed away our things and began to shuffle away, the teacher not even assigning homework. Surprisingly, Cameron returned to class at the end of the day, barely in time for the last 10 minutes of our civics lecture. The principal ushered him in, seemingly back in his zombie-like trance, and he sat silently until the final bell rang. We helped him make his way to the pickup line, David and I steering him while Johnny carried his backpack. Things once again appeared normal, at least the uneasy sort of normal we'd found ourselves in recently. But I couldn't shake the eerie feeling I'd gotten while watching my friend writhe on the ground, screaming about some invisible thing covering him. I watched him more closely than I ever had, waiting for him to collapse and cry out all over again. Eventually, both Johnny and David's parents came and picked them up, and Cameron and I were left alone in the gravel lot of cars and children. That is, until I bent to tie my shoes, and when I stood back up, I saw that Cameron was no longer beside me. My heart rate rising, I turned and searched the sea of children, looking for Cameron's face. I felt panic welling up inside me, as it seemed for one eternal moment, like he had simply disappeared. Then I saw him, walking back towards the school. Confusion replacing my fear, I began to walk after him, wondering where this sudden energy had come from. He made his way past lockers and classrooms, and I followed him all the way to the back of the school, out a set of double doors, and back outside to the baseball field. It seemed obvious now that Cameron was going towards the creek. Why, I didn't know, but I had always heard you should never wake a sleepwalker, and unsure if this was some kind of similar situation, I didn't call out or try to touch him. We made it almost all the way to the creek, but at the last second, Cameron turned, walking instead down the road that led towards his home. Towards the spot where the accident happened. Why was he doing this? It was the most action I had seen him take in months. At this point, I was beyond creeped out and was thinking I should call someone. His parents or mine. Any adult who would come and get us and stop whatever this was. But for some reason, I couldn't. I couldn't do anything but watch and follow, waiting to see what would happen. When we reached the curve in the road where he disappeared that day, I almost called out. My breath was heavy and I was scared, not understanding the situation presented to me. Then I saw that Cameron had stopped. He was standing, motionless, on the exact spot where his body had lain months prior. And coming towards him from the opposite direction was a giant worm. After that, I woke up to a police officer calling out that he had found me. I was lying in some tall grass beside the creek, and early morning light was flickering through the trees. My mom came running into view, kneeling and pulling me into her arms, sobbing as she cradled me like she hadn't since I was a small child. I was taken to the hospital, but the doctors found no evidence that I'd been hurt in any way. Police officers came to ask me what had happened, why I'd been at the creek, and if I knew where Cameron was. I said I didn't know, that I couldn't remember anything after being in the parking lot at the school. This was true at the time. I didn't remember immediately what I'd witnessed happening to Cameron. It came back slowly in the days that followed. Still, I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. I didn't think they would believe me, and I didn't have any particular interest in reliving the event. Instead, I kept it to myself for years, pushing the memory down into my subconscious, until I found myself in therapy after a startling, unrelated incident in which my 4-year-old daughter, Ava, had nearly died from an asthma attack. Ava had woken up in the middle of the night, crying out from her room. By the time my wife and I had gotten there, she was no longer screaming, but wheezing and gasping, unable to speak. Her rescue inhaler didn't work, and we took her to the hospital, where oxygen levels continued to stay low for 2 entire days. After we finally brought her back home, I slept on the floor of her room for weeks. I followed her everywhere around the house. Her room, the kitchen, the living room. I would even stand outside of the bathroom and get nervous if it took more than a couple minutes for her to come out. When I nearly lost my job due to not showing up, my wife finally forced me to get help, knowing that I couldn't continue to live in this constant state of anxiety. The topic of Cameron came up when my therapist asked me if I'd ever experienced the death of someone I was close to. Memories of what I'd seen that day suddenly flooded my mind, and I ended up telling him everything, letting it all out into the open for the first time in years. This is when he told me that I had probably watched my friend die in some way too gruesome for my underdeveloped brain to hold on to. He said that, more than likely, I had simply blocked out what had actually happened, and my mind made up something that was easier to cope with. I nodded when he said this. I'd heard similar things before of what trauma can make us forget, especially when we're still young, so it made sense to me that I'd done the same. I wanted to believe that that was really all that happened. I did believe it for a while, comforted by the knowledge that the 10-foot worm monster couldn't possibly be real. But lately, Ava has been acting a bit off. I've noticed that she hasn't been talking much, her normally chatty demeanor slipping slowly away. I did, however, catch her speaking quietly this morning at the breakfast table. I was cutting up her pancakes for her and trying to get her to take a bite when I noticed her mouth moving slightly. I leaned in close, straining to hear whatever she was trying to tell me, and in her innocent, childish whisper I could hear,
The worms crawl in. The worms crawl out.